The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the hallowed grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, the air carrying the crisp bite of approaching winter. Rows upon rows of pristine white headstones marched across the green hills like silent soldiers standing eternal guard. Among the visitors that afternoon was a young family from the Midwest, a father, a mother, and their curious 4-year-old daughter, Lily, who had come to pay respects to a great uncle buried in these sacred grounds. For Lily's father, Thomas, this visit carried the weight of memory. His uncle had fallen in a conflict far from home, and he wanted his daughter to understand, in whatever small way a child could, the cost of the freedoms they often took for granted. The family made their way toward the tomb of the unknowns, but drawn by the solemn reputation of the changing of the guard ceremony. Lily walked between her parents, her small hand clasped tightly in her father's, her eyes wide with the overwhelming scale of everything around her. She had never seen so many headstones, never felt such profound quiet settle over so many people. Even at her young age, something in the atmosphere told her this was a special place, a place where people spoke in whispers and walked softly. The crowd gathered around the plaza had grown thick, several rows deep, as visitors from across the country waited for the ritual to begin. Thomas lifted Lily onto his shoulders so she could see, and from her perch, she watched with fascination as the sentinel stepped precisely, his movements sharp and deliberate, each pace measured to the exact distance. And the gleam of his rifle caught the sunlight, and to Lily it looked like something from a storybook. A soldier made of marble come to life, performing a dance of perfect seriousness. The ceremony completed, the crowd began its inevitable shift. People checked watches, consulted maps, began the slow migration toward their next destination. But Thomas wanted a photograph, a memory to carry home, to show Lily when she was older and could better understand what she had witnessed. He lowered her to the ground and positioned her near the velvet rope that separated the living from the sacred space, instructing her to stand still for just a moment while he stepped back to frame the shot. His wife, Margaret, stood nearby, already looking at the map, discussing their next stop. The sun, which had been hidden behind thin clouds, broke through at that precise moment, casting a warm glow across the plaza. Thomas lifted his camera, focused on his daughter's small figure with the white marble of the monument behind her, and prepared to capture the moment. What happened next unfolded in seconds, the kind of seconds that stretch into eternity in memory, that replay in slow motion when we recount them later. A butterfly. A simple monarch butterfly, likely one of the last of the season, drawn by some inexplicable instinct to cross the plaza at that exact moment. Lily's attention, which had been fixed on her father and the camera, caught the flash of orange against the gray marble. Her head turned, her eyes followed, and before either of her parents could react, she saw the butterfly settle briefly on the velvet rope just beyond her reach. In the way of 4-year-olds everywhere, Lily's world narrowed to that single point of wonder. The crowd, the ceremony, her father's instructions, all faded before the magical creature resting so close. She took a step toward it. The butterfly lifted, fluttered beyond the rope. Lily, without a thought for rules or boundaries, without any understanding of the sacred space she was about to enter, ducked under the velvet rope and followed. Margaret looked up from her map just in time to see her daughter's small back disappearing toward the monument. The sound that escaped her throat was not quite a scream, not quite a word, just a raw noise of pure terror that cut through the ambient murmur of the crowd. Thomas, still looking through his camera viewfinder, saw his daughter in the frame, then saw her move beyond it. And then for one frozen heartbeat, his brain refused to process what his eyes were telling him. The crowd gasped as one collective body. People who had been turning to leave stopped mid-stride. A woman near the front pressed both hands to her mouth. A man started forward instinctively, only to be held back by his wife's grip on his arm. Everyone understood in that instant what was happening. Everyone knew the stories, the absolute, inviolate orders under which the Sentinels operated. The guards at the Tomb of the Unknowns did not issue warnings. They did not make exceptions. Their instructions were as old as the tradition itself. Any person who crossed the barrier and approached the monument would be met with lethal force, regardless of age, regardless of circumstance. And there, on the plaza, the sentinel on duty had already begun to move. Private First Class Marcus Webb was 22 years old, had been guarding the tomb for 18 months, and had never once faced a situation like this. He had trained for every contingency, drilled until his responses were muscle memory, recited the regulations until they were carved into his consciousness. He knew the orders by heart, had sworn an oath to uphold them, understood that the men buried in this ground had made the ultimate sacrifice and that their resting place demanded the ultimate respect. But standing before him now, walking with the unsteady gait of a very small child toward the monument he was sworn to protect, was not an intruder, not a threat, not any of the scenarios he had trained for. It was a little girl in a pink coat, her hair catching the sunlight, her attention clearly fixed on something he could not see. His training took over. His rifle came up, the movement automatic, precise. His voice, trained to carry across the plaza, rang out with the command he had repeated thousands of times in practice. "I order you to halt." The crowd went silent. Margaret's hand found Thomas's arm, her grip crushing, but neither of them could move, could breathe, could do anything but watch their daughter take another step toward the monument. Lily heard the voice. It was loud, louder than any voice she had ever heard, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. She stopped walking, confused, her head turning to locate the source of the sound. She saw the soldier, the man in the uniform she had watched from her father's shoulders, and she saw that he was pointing something at her. She did not understand what it was, did not comprehend the danger, but she understood that this man was looking at her very intently, and that his face was serious in a way that made her feel strange inside. The butterfly, oblivious to the drama unfolding below, had settled on the marble base of the monument, its wings opening and closing slowly in the autumn sun. Private Webb took a step forward, then another, his cadence unwavering, his rifle still aimed. His mind raced behind the mask of discipline. The orders were clear. The regulations allowed no discretion. If she took 3 more steps, if she crossed the invisible line that his training had etched into his consciousness, he would have no choice. The thought was a physical pain in his chest, but he pushed it aside. He could not afford to think. He could only act. Lily looked from the soldier to the butterfly and back again. The soldier was closer now, and something in his eyes, something beneath the stern expression, reached her in a way the shouted command had not. She was too young to name what she saw, too young to understand the concept of a person fighting an impossible battle within themselves. But she felt it. She felt that this man was not angry at her, that something else was happening, something she did not understand. And then, in a moment that would be analyzed, debated, and marveled at for years to come, Lily lifted her small hand and made a gesture. It was not a wave. It was not a sign of surrender. It was something she had seen her mother do 100 times when her father was upset about something at work, when the weight of the world seemed too heavy for his shoulders. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious. She brought her hand to her heart and then extended it toward him, palm up, as if offering something invisible. In that gesture, Private Webb saw everything. He saw his own little sister, 20 years ago, making the same motion when their mother had been crying. He saw innocence, pure and undefended, looking at him not as a threat but as a human being. He saw a child who had no idea she was in danger, who was simply responding to the intensity of his gaze with the only language she knew. The orders screamed in his mind, the regulations burned in his memory, but something deeper, something older than any oath he had taken, rose up in response. He could not do it. He could not pull that trigger. He would face court-martial, disgrace, or imprisonment. Anything was better than living with the memory of what that bullet would do. His finger, which had been applying steady pressure to the trigger, relaxed. His aim, which had been fixed on the center mass of the small figure before him, wavered. And then, in a movement that violated every regulation in the book, Private Webb lowered his rifle. The crowd gasped again, but this time the sound was different. A release of held breath, a murmur of disbelief. Thomas, released from his paralysis, vaulted over the velvet rope and ran toward his daughter, scooping her into his arms before she could take another step. The butterfly, startled by the sudden movement, lifted from the monument and fluttered away, disappearing into the autumn sky. Private Webb stood frozen, his rifle now at his side, but his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He had broken his oath. He had violated his orders. He had done exactly what his training told him never to do. And yet, as he watched the father clutch his daughter to his chest, as he heard the mother's sobs of relief from beyond the barrier, he knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that he had done the right thing. The relief, however, was short-lived. Within minutes, his superior officer arrived on the scene, summoned by the commotion. The officer's face was carved from stone as he surveyed the situation, the family reunited beyond the barrier, the crowd still murmuring, and his sentinel standing with his rifle lowered, his posture no longer that of a guard, but of a man awaiting judgment. "Private Webb," the officer's voice carried no emotion. "Report to the command post. Now." Webb handed his rifle to the relief guard, who had arrived with the officer, his movements mechanical, his mind still processing what had just occurred. As he walked away from the plaza, he could hear the father's voice behind him, thick with emotion, calling out thanks that he could not bring himself to acknowledge. He had not done it for thanks. He had done it because, in that moment, he had seen his own humanity reflected in a child's eyes, and he had chosen to honor it. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Private Webb was relieved of duty pending review, his fate hanging in the balance of military regulations and the weight of tradition. He sat through hours of questioning, recounting every detail of those seconds that had changed everything. He did not make excuses. He did not defend his actions, and he simply told the truth. He had seen a child in danger, and he had been unable to follow orders that would have harmed her. The officer who had summoned him from the plaza, Captain Reynolds, was a man of 30 years' service, a veteran of 2 wars, a guardian of traditions that stretched back generations. He had seen sentinels face difficult situations before, but never one like this. The regulations were explicit, the training absolute, and yet he could not escape the image of that small hand reaching out, that tiny figure standing before the monument. On the 3rd day of the investigation, Captain Reynolds visited Private Webb in the quarters where he was confined pending the outcome. Webb stood at attention as the captain entered, his face carefully blank, prepared for whatever judgment would be delivered. "At ease, oh, Private," Reynolds said, his voice less formal than it had been during the interrogations. He stood by the window, looking out at the cemetery grounds visible in the distance. "I've watched the witness statements, I've reviewed every second of the security footage, and I've spent 3 nights trying to decide what I would have done in your position." Webb said nothing, waiting. Reynolds turned to face him. "You know the orders. You know what you were trained to do. You know that what you did could have ended your career, put you in prison, destroyed everything you've worked for." "Yes, sir." "And yet you did it anyway." "Yes, sir." Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, more human than Webb had ever heard it. "I have a granddaughter. She's 4 years old. Same age as that little girl." He shook his head slowly. "I keep trying to picture her standing where Lily stood. I keep trying to imagine what I would have done if it had been my finger on that trigger." He moved away from the window, took a seat across from Webb. "The regulations exist for a reason. The men buried here gave everything. Their resting place demands the utmost respect, the most absolute protection. But those men didn't give their lives so that we could kill children. They fought for something, for a country, for ideals, for the right of little girls to chase butterflies without being shot." Webb felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized had been wound so tight. "I'm not saying what you did was right according to the book," Reynolds continued. "According to the book, you failed. You disobeyed a direct order, violated protocol, compromised the integrity of your position. But the book doesn't have a chapter for this situation. The book was written by people who never imagined a child wandering toward the monument, who never considered that the ultimate test of a sentinel might not be his accuracy with a rifle but his capacity for human judgment." The captain stood, preparing to leave. "The investigation will run its course. There will be consequences. I won't lie to you about that. You'll likely face disciplinary action, maybe even discharge. But when they ask for my recommendation, I'll tell them what I just told you, and I'll tell them something else too." Webb looked up, meeting his eyes. "That little girl's father called this morning. He wanted me to pass along a message. He said that whatever happens to you, whatever consequences you face, you will always have a home with his family. He said that his daughter talks about you every night before she goes to sleep. She tells people about the soldier who protected her from the butterfly." For the first time in 3 days, Private Marcus Webb smiled. The story of that afternoon spread far beyond the gates of Arlington National Cemetery. It appeared in newspapers, was discussed on television programs, became a topic of debate in military circles and civilian living rooms alike. Some argued that Private Webb should be court-martialed for dereliction of duty, that the sanctity of the tomb required absolute adherence to protocol regardless of circumstance. Others hailed him as a hero, a man who had the courage to prioritize humanity over regulation. And the official outcome was a compromise, as such things often are. Private Webb was formally reprimanded for violation of standing orders, a mark on his record that would prevent further advancement in his military career. But he was not court-martialed, not imprisoned, not subjected to the harshest penalties the regulations allowed. Instead, he was reassigned to administrative duty, his days of guarding the tomb at an end. On his last day at Arlington, before reporting to his new post, Webb received permission to visit the tomb one final time. He stood at the barrier, the same barrier Lily had crossed weeks earlier, and looked at the monument that had defined his life for 18 months. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plaza, and the autumn air held the promise of winter to come. He did not hear the small footsteps behind him until a small hand slipped into his own. Lily looked up at him, her face serious in the way of children who are trying to convey something important. Behind her, Thomas and Margaret stood at a respectful distance, their expressions warm with gratitude. "I brought you something," Lily said, her voice matter-of-fact. She held up her other hand, and Webb saw that she was holding a small drawing, a crude representation, rendered in crayon, of a soldier standing before a white monument. Above the soldier, a butterfly fluttered on orange wings. "It's you," Lily explained, pointing to the figure. "And that's the butterfly I was chasing. Mama said you got in trouble for not shooting me, so I wanted you to have this." Webb knelt down, bringing himself to her level, and took the drawing carefully in his hands. He looked at it for a long moment, at the lopsided soldier, the oversized butterfly, the bright colors that spoke of a child's unfiltered vision of the world. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "This is the best gift I've ever received." Lily studied his face with the intense scrutiny of the very young, apparently satisfied with what she found there. Then, without warning, she threw her arms around his neck in a hug that spoke of absolute trust, absolute forgiveness for a danger she had never understood. Webb closed his eyes and held her for just a moment, feeling the small weight of her against him, feeling something heal in a part of himself he hadn't known was broken. When Lily finally pulled back, she had one more thing to say. "Mama says you saved my life. But I don't think you would have hurt me anyway. I saw your eyes. You look like my daddy looks when he's trying not to be mad, but he still loves me." She ran back to her parents then, leaving Webb kneeling on the plaza, with a crayon drawing clutched in his hands and tears he could not stop running down his cheeks. The years passed, as years do. Lily grew up, went to school, became a young woman with her own memories and her own understanding of the world. She kept the story of that autumn day in her heart, told it to friends, wrote about it in school assignments. But she never forgot the soldier who had lowered his rifle, who had chosen her life over his orders. On her 18th birthday, she received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph, a picture of a young soldier standing before the tomb of the unknowns, his face serious, his uniform perfect. Tucked behind the photograph was a small drawing, faded now with age, of a soldier and a butterfly. On the back of the photograph, in careful handwriting, were 3 words: "I saw you too." Private Marcus Webb had been discharged from the military years ago, had gone on to become a teacher, had raised a family of his own. But he had never forgotten the little girl who had reached out to him across the divide of duty and regulation, who had shown him that some things matter more than orders. And Lily, now a young woman preparing to vote for the first time, preparing to make her own way in the world, understood something profound about that day. The soldier had not saved her from the bullet he might have fired. He had saved her from something deeper, from the knowledge that the world could be so cold, so rigid, so bound by rules that it would sacrifice innocence for protocol. He had shown her that even in the most disciplined, most regulated of circumstances, human beings could choose compassion. She framed the photograph and the drawing together, hung them on her wall where she would see them every day. And whenever she faced difficult choices, moments when the rules pointed one way and her heart pointed another, she looked at that soldier and remembered. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is break the rules for the right reasons. Sometimes the highest duty is not to orders but to humanity. And sometimes a 4-year-old chasing a butterfly can teach the world something about what really matters. And the tomb of the unknown still stands guard over the remains of those who gave everything. The sentinels still walk their precise paces, still carry their gleaming rifles, still honor the fallen with every step. And the orders remain absolute, inviolate, unforgiving. But every sentinel who walks that hallowed ground now knows the story. Every guard who trains for the impossible understands that somewhere in the back of their mind, beneath the discipline and the duty, there lives a question. What would I have done? And perhaps in that question, Private Marcus Webb's legacy lives on, not as a rebuke to the regulations, but as a reminder that the men buried in that ground gave their lives so that the living could be free to make such choices, so that a soldier could look at a child and see not a threat, but a reason, so that a little girl could chase a butterfly without fear. The autumn sun still sets over Arlington, casting long shadows across the white headstones. The butterflies still migrate through on their way south, and somewhere, a woman with a framed photograph on her wall still tells her children the story of the soldier who saw her, truly saw her, in a moment when seeing meant everything.